let's get started. Good afternoon. If you're on the East Coast, it's 1:30, 3:30, or 4:30, 1:30 on the East Coast, and I guess it would be 9:30 on the West Coast. Sorry, I'm all turning around today. But thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And this session is a continuation of a series we've been putting together about cloud and cloud education. And today we're here to talk about securing your remote workforce from cyber attacks. My name is Bob Buchanan. I'm the EVP of Sales for Cox Business Cloud Computing, and have a great story for you. Before we get kicked off, let me start with by letting everyone know that today's session will be recorded. So during the session, if you have a question, please use the chat. The chat functionality, and we will do everything we can to get to every question at the end of the session. And then we'll also send out a recording, the recording to everyone who's registered, so you'll have it. If you missed some of it, you'll have it for reference later on. A little bit about Cox Business Cloud Solutions, and I'll be brief here. The technology is powered by RapidScale, which is an independent company that was acquired in 2018, so almost 2 years for that transaction. And today we really are part of fully integrated as the Cox Business Cloud Solutions division, and just a really safe place to put your cloud business. And we couldn't be happier to be part of the family. Really focus heavily on the customer experience. You can see there an NPS score of 78, which is industry leading. How we help our customers. We try to keep this message pretty simple, but we've really focused on trying to close gaps from an IT capacity standpoint, or the things that maybe you're doing today that you'd rather outsource, that maybe aren't strategic, and enabling our customers to focus on really the efficiencies of their business versus maybe the more maintenance type things. And those might fall into the category of infrastructure as a service, desktop as a service, obviously traditional connectivity, SD-WAN, and definitely security. So today, we are here to focus heavily on the security aspect. And when folks think of security, they think of all types of things, brute force attacks and the perimeter, and all those things are relevant. But even more so as we're in this very unique time with the COVID impact to our businesses and our lives, we've got more and more folks working from home, and the human element comes into play. And that's where our partnership with Mimecast is so very important. And I'm here today to introduce and welcome Luis Rodriguez, who is a senior engineer with Mimecast, who's going to walk you through really a lot of the threats that we're facing in the industry, what you should be aware of, and how to protect your business. Luis, I'll turn it over to you. And man, I'm all tied up on time. I guess it would be 10:30 on the Pacific time. I'll let somebody who knows a lot more about this technology on the security side take over, and I'll take a back seat. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you everybody in the audience for allowing us to share with you some useful information about how to protect the remote workforce. Let me give you a little bit of information about Mimecast. We were founded in 2003. We are listed in the NASDAQ, and we offer a software as a service solution, and we're extremely focused on securing email and helping companies become more cyber resilient. That simply means that we're protecting organizations before, during, and after a cyber attack. So we're very excited about the partnership with the Cox Business Solutions. And we currently protect over 38,000 customers worldwide, and we are analyzing billions of emails per day. And with that unique vantage point and through that lens, we can share some insights about how to secure the remote workforce. So let's take a deeper dive. About 94% of all organizations have experienced phishing attacks in the last 12 months. So that's a really, really high number. Those cyber attacks can lead to breaches. The average breach, it's about 279 days. That's a life cycle of the breach, from the time the incident occurred through containment. And that has led to an average cost of a breach in the US of about $3.92 million. And the reason why I like to start off with these statistics is to show that this is a problem that is impacting all businesses, regardless of their size. And that is illustrated in this graph, and this is part of an IBM study about the cost of a data breach. And we can see that organizations with less than 500 employees are showing an average cost of $2.74 million, not that far off from larger organizations, right? An organization from 1,000 to 5,000 employees has an average cost of a breach of $3.63 million. So you can see that it is really impacting all business sizes. And it also matters because all businesses are potential targets. Another thing, an interesting fact about the cost of a breach is that the cost can be felt over time. About 1/3 of the data breach costs occurred more than 1 year after the data breach incident occurred. So some really interesting statistics there. So let's talk about why are we such a soft target? Why are businesses such a soft target, right? What are the problems that businesses are facing? Well, skill shortage, for one, is a big problem. Employee burnout, external distractions. I can't imagine in the current situation, the post-COVID world that we're living in, that people are able to focus 100% on their day-to-day work when they have their kids at home. They're working sometimes in smaller spaces and don't have all their access to all the office resources. So there's some challenging times that we're experiencing, to say the least. And also legacy and non-existing processes to deal with a new remote workforce. There's many organizations that were not prepared for the employees to be working from home and really didn't have the capacity to really bring in the extra or deal with the extra requests for help when employees all of a sudden have to work from home. And that has been very common. So let's look at the data that criminals are after. If we look at why criminals are targeting organizations, right? They're trying to get to the valuable intellectual property. Hackers are after sensitive research or intellectual property that they can sell out to other organizations or figure out how to monetize. It's always about money in the end. Also, personal identifiable information can be a big target for attackers. Patient data, credit history, personal history. For example, this information is then sold or used to commit identity theft, payroll theft, tax fraud, and even loan theft. So that is another aspect, again, that attackers are looking to monetize the data that they can extract. Also, organizations have large internal applications, large customer databases, rich with personal details, and even payroll systems. And it can also be information about your internal systems or procedures to try to expand more laterally inside the organization, right? If we look at what are some of the attacks that have been successful, for many businesses, email is a formal system of records. Email is also the mechanism to infiltrate the organization. And hackers can be successful exploiting vulnerabilities, exploiting the weakest link, which is humans. And that's why phishing attacks, ransomware, and malware are, for the most part, exploiting the weakest link in the organization, which is the humans. And those are the vehicles for success. It's much easier to craft an email with a lookalike domain than it is to breach a firewall, for example. So that's why it's critical to understand the type of attacks that attackers are using to be successful. And we'll give you some examples about that. If we look at how Mimecast looks at protecting customers, regardless of their size, we have a framework that we call Email 3.0. And that simply means that we are looking at email in a lens of different zones, right? When we look at the perimeter, in the traditional sense of the word, the perimeter is the demarcation point between the business and the outside world. In this new world where a lot of the these services that companies are using are hosted in the cloud, this is a logical perimeter, right? We look at inside the perimeter. These are threats that attackers are using to expand laterally or to compromise other internal users, compromise your brand as well. Because when a credential compromise attack, for example, you can see that an attacker will try to send malicious link to other internal users, because when a user sees an email from another employee within the organization, they automatically have implicit trust. And that is one of the favorite attack vectors. So inside the organization is another attack vector that we look at. And also beyond the perimeter, if we look at analyzing emails that are coming from companies that are spoofing your domains or third-party attackers that can use your own domains to try to impersonate your brand and exfiltrate money, exfiltrate information from your customers. So these are the zones that Mimecast is very focused on protecting and also integrating with a larger ecosystem. And through this lens, we're going to talk about some examples, right? If we look at, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. If we look at Zone 1, the type of attacks that we see in Zone 1 are phishing attacks, malicious URLs, it's ransomware, malware, anti-spam, viruses as well. And also, it's looking at the inbound email traffic and the outbound email traffic. If we look at an impersonation attack, the traditional attack impersonates your company, right, and your people. If we look at an attacker can simply log into Google, request a Gmail account, and try to simple display name impersonation to fool your internal users to think that an executive or a VIP is using a personal email address to make a request, right? It could be to get somebody to do something, send them gift cards, or it could be to actually click on a link. What we're seeing as well is that attackers are leveraging impersonation attacks using the names of ex-employees trying to ask for additional help. They forgot some information or they need a document. So these are pretty common tactics that we're seeing. And it's hard to detect because they're legitimate emails. So that's why it's important to be able to understand the threats and educate your users of how to spot the simple impersonations, right? And what to do, coach them to be on the lookout for these type of attacks. If we look at a more sophisticated attack, what we're seeing is that attackers are using lookalike domains. In the case of this example, this is an older email that we receive internally in the company and help us to develop some of the technology that is looking at detecting what we call indicators of an attack. So the lookalike domain, custom domains, homoglyph domains, and all, for those of you that are not familiar with those terms, I'll give you an example that a little bit later in the presentation. But also, again, display name impersonations. In this attack, the attacker was trying to impersonate our CFO during the time of our IPO, and they were requesting wire transfer. So we see the lookalike domains, we see the display name impersonation. This domain, Mimecast, as you can see, if you're looking at it from a mobile device, is very hard to detect if somebody has problems with their eye. So that's what the attackers are banking on, is that somebody will miss that, right? Or somebody's distracted, like we just talked about in the current COVID-19 era. People working from home and mobile devices, personal devices. They also leverage a newly registered domain. So this domain was newly registered 3 days before they sent out the first email. And also it included keywords, and these are all indicators of an attack. Reply to mismatch is another one, and also the use of the names of a VIP, for example. So these are common indicators of an attack that we're seeing in the platform and that we're able to detect. If we look at the current type of attacks that we're seeing in the COVID-19 era. They also try to generate a sense of urgency. So this was a phishing attack targeting a hospital staff, basically faking coronavirus awareness training, and they were trying to get them to sign up so they can capture their username and passwords. So this was something that we're seeing a lot of now, since in the month of March, we detected over 60,000 new sites registered, and they were COVID-19 related. So about 6,000 per day. It's crazy. And these type of attacks lead to credential harvesting, to downloading malware, and other types of ransomware as well. So these are the type of attacks you need to educate your users and give them actual practical examples of what you're seeing in the field, right? The notes from the trenches, as a good friend likes to call them. If we look at attacks that we're seeing leverage against the zone 2 inside the perimeter, right? Those are internal emails. We also like to focus on training people and delivering security awareness and helping with insider threats, right? So the reason why this zone is critical, as I mentioned a little bit before, is because this is where a lot of the human error lives, right? Your employees can be malicious in case of a disgruntled employee. They could be negligent, or they can just be distracted, right? They don't mean to do harm, but they're going to click on the link if they see a DocuSign impersonation or a fake voicemail. These are things that I've seen in a production environment as well. And attackers are using various mechanisms and delivery vehicles as well. So, for instance, if somebody impersonates or is able to do a credential harvesting attack of an internal user account, they're going to be sending fake URLs. I have seen people's LinkedIn accounts be hacked, and they're sending malicious links as well. So web security is another aspect of the Zone 2 protections, right? To make sure that when customers are going to these links, or when your end users are going to these links, that you have some sort of layer of protection, especially now that you have so many users working from home. So that's going to be important. So if we look at the reason why this is so important, we've done research, and we see that about 60 to 80% of all the emails that are shared in an organization are internal emails. Yet many organizations are not inspecting the internal email. Some of the benefits of inspecting the internal email could be detecting malicious attachments and links. It could be also for data loss prevention, capabilities that can be used for determining content that violates your corporate policies. It could be inappropriate language. If you're in the education space, it can be bullying of the students. But also notifying administrators of, again, malicious links that are being sent to the organization. That could indicate that there's a compromised account as well. So that visibility is going to be important, especially because regardless of the device, that you're still examining that content and delivering it to the tablets, to the mobile users and devices at home. So they're not inside, they're logically inside, but in reality, that's part of your remote workforce. If we look at the Zone 3, right? What are the things that you cannot control beyond the perimeter, right? We talked a little bit about web security, accessing the links that are being shared in the Zone 2. And when a user clicks on the link, they're going to go out and make a DNS request and try to go to a website. So that's going to be important. Also, it is important to protect your brand. You know, there's a lot of domains that are being registered that are trying to impersonate your brand. It can be a lookalike domain. It doesn't necessarily have to be a domain that you own, but it's also important to protect the domains that you own. So that's why we say that Zone 3 is protecting beyond your perimeter. An example of the brand protection, for example, Pizza Hut realized that there was a lot of impersonations, and there was an article about how it is important for them to be aware of domains that are impersonating their brand, so that people are not giving their information, their credit card as well. So brand protection is important. And the domains that you do own, you don't want somebody to send emails on behalf of your domain for malicious purposes. So that's going to be a key aspect of protecting your organization as well. If we look at also why this is important, 99% of all malware is in via email and web. Remote users, for example, rely on web applications for their day-to-day work, to share information, to develop social and professional connections, and they also use it to conduct research. So these are aspects to keep in mind. I'm going to give you an example of why this is so important. We took the Mimecast domain. We have multiple domains, and we ran a little report about domain variations. And you can do this very simply. I'll give you some links, some links of how you guys can identify lookalike domains for your own internal domains and those of your suppliers. But for Mimecast specifically, we saw that there was 24 registered domains, and about 275 of those were available. And some of those can be different characters that are inserted. Some of them can be characters or homoglyph attack, relying on international domains. So they're leveraging Cyrillic characters or non-ASCII characters to fool the users. So those are called homoglyph attacks, right? There's bit squatting, replacement, insertions. There's many ways to impersonate a domain, and that's why this is so critical. Okay, in a real world scenario, if we look at a domain such as Paychex, Paychex is a payroll and HR solution organization, and I took this domain, the paychex.com, and I went into a website called DNS Twister. You can Google DNS Twister report, and you'll see this site. You enter your own internal domain, and you can see how many domains are available to register, or how many domains have already been can be available for purchase. And you can see that some of the examples I'm putting on the screen are very hard for an end user to distinguish. So even though they're leveraging an international domain, this is the actual domain. This is how it renders to the end users. Again, a non-ASCII character. So this is why it's so easy for attackers to leverage these type of attacks and bypass your current securities if you're not employing technology that is aware of these type of impersonations. And that also applies to your suppliers. There's been a lot of news of supply chain impersonations, where a company is paying thinks they're paying a vendor, but in reality, they've just transferred money to an attacker. So you can imagine how this problem can be multiplied, right? And it really affects any business. So if we look at how easy it is to leverage this type of domains, I can go into GoDaddy and register these domains for very little money. And then go ahead and register a service with Office 365 to send them email on that behalf. So I'm not a programmer. It takes me probably a good half a day to set up an attack like this if I wanted to do an impersonation of a brand. Some of my smarter coworkers can actually do this in minutes through the use of automation elements and scripting languages. So this is something that attackers are using more, and you guys should be aware of. If we look at the effects of a breach in summary, before we talk about actionable information that you guys can use to protect your end users, your remote workforce, look at in a production what this looks like, right? If we see an email with a character such as a Cyrillic character such as this W, I typically notice these things in a mobile device or in a tablet device. That's why it's going to be important for you guys to be able to highlight these type of impersonations in the actual domain for your end user, especially if they're at home in a web-based portal accessing the email, or on a mobile device that they don't see, in most cases, the entire address, depending on the service provider that you use. That's going to be important. So that educating your users about these type of threats. A good tip from a prospect that talked to us, something that they did is every week they send out a summary of the most blatant attacks that they receive and educate their users. And they just publish that and send a newsletter, an internal newsletter, so they could educate their internal users. So continuous education is critical. So in summary, the detrimental effects of a cyber attack: reputational damage, loss of customers, identity theft, difficulty attracting top talent, and significant financial losses. So that's why it's important for you to, again, educate your internal users. So let's talk about, at a macro level, what are some of the things a company can do to improve their security posture? Invest in more security training for the entire organization. That is going to be key. Mimecast analyzed data over the last 100 days of COVID, and we realized that the customers that were using security awareness programs, their employees were less likely to click on a link, on a malicious link, than companies that did not implement continuous awareness training. So that's going to be very important. If we look at also integration, that's going to be another key aspect of it. There are so many companies that have different point solutions, and it makes it really hard for attackers, for the IT and security teams to protect the organization. So leveraging automation capabilities is going to be important because you're able to share that threat intelligence. Many of the SaaS providers can do this now. Share the threat intelligence with the firewalls, for example, with the endpoint, and there's some synergies that can be leveraged to make sure that there's pervasive security. Also, testing and planning for different breach scenarios. When we've done tabletop exercises with customers and prospects, it's amazing how many issues were not previously considered that come up in conversation. So in many cases, you can see the aha moment when customers realize, yes, this is something I probably should adopt. And just really understanding how prepared are you in case of a breach. Prioritize risk and understand what your data is telling you. So that's going to be critical. So more practical advice based on the threat intelligence that we're seeing. So we can see, for example, an analysis of email from January to March, that the type of attacks that were increased, for example, spam, we saw an increase of 26% over the previous year, right? The same thing for impersonation detection, 33% increase. Increase of malware detections, blocking of URLs also increased by 55%. So you can tell that there's a lot of a surge on the type of attacks that are being delivered via email in this COVID era, since attackers know that there's a lot of more users working from home. So it's going to be very, very important for you guys to leverage your technology in ways that are innovative and helping to at least slow down the rate of attacks that are getting to your end users and educating your end users. So if we look at practical advice at organizational level, more micro level, we can look at implementing technology that can understand the lookalike domains, cousin domains, homoglyphs, both for web and email. Look for newly observed domains, display name impersonations, reply to mismatch. These are common tactics that attackers are leveraging. Leverage DLP technology as well to look at content that could contain indicators of an attack. If we look at awareness training, the awareness training, as I mentioned, was very critical because in in the breaches, the human element plays a big factor. I think the last statistic that I read was about 97% of all breaches involve human error. So organizations that implement continuous training are better off. And in the same IBM report that I mentioned at the beginning, they also mentioned that employee training decreased the total cost of a data breach in some cases by $270,000. So it can make a big impact. But most organizations are not leveraging continuous training. They're leveraging some compliance training that they do once a year, and in reality is not very engaging, and that's why it's not effective. So that's going to be very important. Leverage safe file conversion capabilities. For example, a lot of the emails that we see organizations sending that contain attachments, the majority of them are read-only attachments. When I've worked with customers in production environments, so sometimes I've seen the number as high as 60% of all the email attachments that are going back and forth that are some sort of office documents or PDFs. So there are technologies out there to de-risk that and make sure you're stripping away any malware from the attachments, that employees cannot inadvertently click on that and download that and expose your organization to backdoors or ransomware. And for the remote workers specifically, you want to make sure that they're updating their home Wi-Fi with strong passwords, that they never click on COVID-related attachments that they receive from outside or untrusted references of untrusted senders. Make sure that they double check on links if suspicious, that they don't click on that. Make sure that they're when they provide their credentials, that they're looking at the correct domain. That's going to be key. If you use any sort of rewrite capabilities for URLs, that you're embedding the domain, so when they hover over the links, they can see that, and that they do not use personal devices at home to access the organization's network or data or emails. And also two-factor authentication is a good practice to enable that whenever possible throughout the different technologies that they're using. So those are some of the main recommendations. So we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. I'm not sure if there's any questions.
Yes, there are. So here is the first one. Are phishing attackers one-trick ponies, or are they typically skilled at other cybersecurity exploits too?
Well, what we're seeing, what the data is showing, that's a very good question, is that these attackers are operating as organizations. So email is one of the ways that they can penetrate an organization. Is the number one way, right? But they have other ways that they can leverage. I myself have received SMS with malicious links. In some cases, they've hacked, as I mentioned, LinkedIn accounts. That's why web security is so important. So they're working as operations, and they see their mission and their livelihood is depending on trying to infiltrate your organization. So I consider them one-trick ponies in most cases.
Okay. Next up, do I need to have all of my services in the cloud to be able to use Mimecast?
It's not necessarily. There's still a lot of organizations that have on-prem, but there are efficiencies to be gained by leveraging cloud technologies that in some cases have better controls than what you have on-prem, and also better integration, because a lot of the cloud technologies are leveraging APIs that can be used to integrate, as I mentioned, with other solutions.
Okay. How difficult are these services to implement, and how long does it take?
Yeah, you know what? I might give, this is Bob Summer, I'll take that one. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that one size fits all here, because just depending on scope, the number of users, the amount of data, there's a number of different variables. I think a good rule of thumb is, 2 to 4 weeks, and you can be absolutely up and running. Luis, I don't know if you concur with that, but that's what we're seeing. And I'll also note that, you know, that Cox Business Cloud Solutions and Mimecast work very closely on these implementations. So we've got an entire methodology around the implementation process. But from a complexity standpoint and time frame, I would look at, you know, it's not as complex as it sounds, and in 2 to 4 weeks is probably a good estimate.
That's spot on, Bob. Thank you.
Great. A couple more questions, but feel free to keep chatting them over if you guys have them in the Q&A box. In regards to the threat intelligence report that you've referenced, Luis, can you talk about the volume of emails that are tracked to determine those trends?
Absolutely. So in the report that we published earlier this year, we analyzed over 290 billion emails, if I remember correctly, because we're seeing billions of emails per day. It's incredible, the volume that we process.
Yeah, wow, that is a lot. And then what are some best practices for user education around security?
I would say that the number one is make sure that you're using the content that is engaging. The feedback that we've gotten from customers is that security training has traditionally been very boring, tedious. Customers are not paying attention. The end users are not paying attention. They simply don't learn. So if you don't engage your audience, you're wasting your time, and you're even probably causing a detrimental effect on the organization, because you're not helping them to be more productive. Also, make sure that it's continuous. I believe the data shows that. We've done a lot of studies, and that's one of the reasons why we leverage micro training sessions for our training.
Okay, and we just got another one here. If a hacker gains access through phishing, does it assume the role of the compromised user? Is the compromised contained to the areas of the network the user has permissions to access?
Well, it depends on the scenario, but in most cases, we have heard, for example, that somebody is able to steal the credentials, and they're able to change passwords and access, or create backdoors. So in most cases, it's not. And that's why it's so important to not only look at the perimeter, but also the internal email, because those attackers will try to make sure that they have a stronghold inside your network. And that could be by creating backdoors, by sending malicious attachments, malicious links, because naturally, once they've penetrated the organization, they try to expand their footprint. So that's going to be very critical. And that's why it's important to leverage automation as well, to be able to detect those anomalies.
Okay. Is it possible to send out fake phishing emails to test your employees?
Yes, there's some of the awareness training, or that's one of the services that we do offer. It is the capability to, after you train and you've educated your users, be able to test them and be able to measure the success of your training. And one of those components is the phishing simulation.
Great. And it looks like that is it for questions. I think there's one more slide if you guys want to wrap it up then.
I have one more question that may be something for Bob, or a follow-up for somebody in the Cox team. It came from Thomas, and it was, are we offering some kind of penetration test and follow-up actions? So Bob, I'm not sure if you have any comments. Mimecast does not.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and one we field regularly. We get it asked a lot, like I mentioned, but we would refer the customer to a third-party partner in that instance, just based on the requirements. It's sometimes seen as maybe a conflict if we're doing a penetration test on our own infrastructure we're supporting. But if you reach out to your sales representative, we'll get you in the right. We'll get that customer in the right direction. All right. So, you know what? If anything that we've covered here today strikes some interest and you'd like to learn more, and certainly would like to learn more about the partnership between Cox Cloud and Mimecast, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to us, specifically reach out to your sales rep in market, and we would be more than happy to engage with you and help educate you further. And with that, we will let everyone go and stay safe.